March 6, 1943. Spitla Airfield, Tunisia. Lieutenant General George S. Patton stepped off the transport aircraft into air still carrying the acrid smell of burned rubber and defeat. Across the airfield's damaged runway, the wreckage of American vehicles lay scattered like discarded toys, their olive-drab paint blackened by fire.
Keep the pressure on those Panzers.
20 days earlier, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had torn through American lines at Kasserine Pass, killing over 6,000 soldiers, destroying 183 tanks, and shattering every assumption about how quickly green troops could be transformed into effective combat forces. The defeat had been comprehensive. It had also been instructive.
Too late to change anything now.
Patton had arrived to assume command of Tactical Corps, the battered American formation that had crumbled before Rommel's veterans. His orders were straightforward. Restore discipline, rebuild morale, prepare for offensive operations. But what greeted him at Allied headquarters revealed a challenge that went beyond military reconstruction. The British command structure, from Field Marshal Harold Alexander downward, had drawn conclusions from Kasserine that would poison Anglo-American relations for the remainder of the war. Alexander's assessment, drafted for the combined chiefs of staff in Washington and London, read like an indictment. American commanders lacked experience in mobile warfare. American troops lacked the discipline necessary for sustained combat. American units required, in Alexander's carefully chosen words, extensive British supervision before they could be trusted with significant responsibilities. The report was not entirely unfair. Kasserine had exposed genuine deficiencies in American leadership, tactics, and combined arms coordination. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, Patton's predecessor, had commanded from a headquarters 70 miles behind the front lines, issuing confusing orders that fragmented American defensive positions. Tank units had been committed piecemeal. Artillery coordination had failed. Infantry had broken under pressure that veteran troops would have absorbed. But Alexander's response went beyond corrective criticism into something more corrosive. In his operational concept for the final Tunisian campaign, Second Corps would be assigned supporting missions, while British forces executed the decisive attacks. American troops would draw German reserves away from the main effort. American blood would purchase British glory. The architect of this approach was approaching Tunisia from the east, his reputation preceding him like a herald announcing royalty. General Bernard Law Montgomery, commanding the British Eighth Army, had broken Rommel at El Alamein 5 months earlier, ending a string of British defeats that had stretched from Dunkirk through Singapore to Tobruk. Churchill had found in Montgomery a general who won battles. The British public had found a hero whose beret and confident pronouncements offered reassurance after years of disaster. Montgomery had found in himself confirmation of convictions he had held since the trenches of the First World War. That meticulous preparation, overwhelming firepower, and methodical execution would defeat any enemy, and that he alone among Allied commanders truly understood these principles. Montgomery's operational plan for Tunisia reflected these convictions with crystalline clarity. Eighth Army would deliver the primary blow against the Mareth Line, the fortified Axis positions in southern Tunisia that blocked the coastal route to Tunis. The attack would employ Montgomery's signature approach: massive artillery preparation, infantry assault to create gaps, armored exploitation through the breaches. Success was, in Montgomery's confident assessment, assured. 2 Corps would conduct supporting attacks in central Tunisia, fixing German reserves and preventing their concentration against Eighth Army's advance. The Americans would serve as Montgomery's shield while the British claimed the victory. Patton understood immediately what was at stake. This was not merely about defeating Rommel. It was about proving that American arms could stand alongside their British counterparts, as equals rather than apprentices. His diary entries from March 1943 documented his fury with what he termed British presumption and his determination to demonstrate American worth through the only currency that mattered in warfare: aggressive, successful action. The mathematics of the Tunisian campaign reinforced British assumptions about proper command relationships. Montgomery's Eighth Army comprised approximately 220,000 troops, veterans of 2 years of desert warfare against Rommel's Afrika Korps. They had learned their trade through painful experience at Gazala, Tobruk, and the grinding attritional battles that preceded El Alamein. They knew how to coordinate infantry, armor, and artillery. They understood German tactics and had developed counters through trial and error. Patton's II Corps numbered roughly 90,000 men, most of whom had never heard a shot fired in anger before Kasserine. His tank crews had trained on American soil against American doctrine, never facing the reality of German 88mm guns that could destroy a Sherman at ranges where American guns couldn't penetrate Panzer armor. His infantry had conducted exercises, not combat operations. The qualitative gap was real, and British commanders never let Americans forget it. Alexander's headquarters, designated 18th Army Group, oversaw all Allied ground forces in Tunisia. The staff was entirely British. When Alexander visited II Corps on March the 12th to present the operational plan, he arrived with no American officers in his entourage. Patton noted the slight with bitter precision. Here was an Allied commander, nominally responsible for coordinating British and American forces, who apparently saw no need for American representation on his own staff. The message was unmistakable. Americans would be commanded, not consulted. Patton launched his offensive toward El Guettar on March 17, 1943. His orders reflected his personality, demanding aggressive leadership at every level. Officers would lead from the front, visible to their men. American troops would demonstrate the same fighting spirit that had characterized their grandfathers in the trenches of 1918. Whatever the cost, II Corps would prove it deserved treatment as a combat formation rather than a collection of uniformed civilians. The Battle of El Guettar provided the vindication Patton sought. On March 23rd, 50 German tanks of the 10th Panzer Division emerged from mountain passes into the El Guettar Valley, executing a dawn attack designed to shatter American defenses and restore the initiative Rommel had lost at Kasserine. What followed shocked German commanders who had grown accustomed to American units breaking under armored assault. American artillery, positioned with careful attention to overlapping fields of fire, unleashed devastating concentrations on the advancing panzers. Tank destroyers, dug into positions that exploited terrain advantages, engaged German armor at ranges that negated German tactical superiority. By noon, the valley floor was littered with burning German vehicles. By evening, the 10th Panzer Division had lost 32 tanks and hundreds of soldiers. For the first time, American forces had defeated experienced German armored units in sustained combat. The victory transformed American morale. Soldiers who had fled at Kasserine now held positions against German armor and won. Officers who had issued confused orders now coordinated combined arms with growing confidence. Patton's merciless discipline, his insistence on proper uniforms and military bearing even in combat zones, had rebuilt II Corps into something that resembled a professional fighting force. But recognition from British headquarters remained grudging at best. Alexander's staff, focused on Montgomery's operations against the Mareth Line, paid minimal attention to the Second Corps' success. British liaison officers at Patton's headquarters continued issuing detailed instructions that implied American commanders couldn't be trusted to manage their own operations. More galling still, Alexander repeatedly changed II Corps' objectives, shifting priorities in ways that ensured American forces remained auxiliary to British operations. Patton would be ordered to advance, then halt, attack with armor, then lead with infantry. Each change disrupted American planning and signaled that II Corps existed primarily to facilitate Montgomery's plans rather than achieve independent objectives. Montgomery's assault on the Mareth Line began on March 20th with confidence that bordered on public guarantee. Yet the initial attack made little progress against determined German resistance. Italian and German defenders, fighting from prepared positions, absorbed Eighth Army's artillery bombardment, and repulsed infantry assaults that Montgomery had predicted would crack the line. The field marshal adapted, shifting his main effort to a flanking maneuver through the Tabaga Gap. The modification demonstrated the tactical flexibility that characterized Montgomery's best operations, but it required time, allowing German forces to establish new defensive positions further north. By the time Eighth Army broke through, the opportunity for decisive pursuit had passed. Throughout April 1943, the Second Corps continued its supporting attacks in central Tunisia. American forces advanced steadily, taking objectives and inflicting casualties on Axis defenders. The 1st Infantry Division, the 1st Armored Division, and the 9th Infantry Division gained experience that would prove invaluable in Sicily and beyond. But British reporting minimized these achievements. Press coverage celebrated Montgomery's breakthrough while treating American operations as footnotes. When the victory parade was held in Tunis on May 20, 1943, with General Eisenhower, Alexander, and French General Henry Giraud taking the salute, the narrative emphasized British and French achievements. American contributions received cursory acknowledgement. For American commanders reading these reports, Tunisia provided lessons that transcended tactics and logistics. They learned that fighting alongside the British meant fighting for recognition as well as victory. They discovered that Montgomery, whatever his military talents, seemed constitutionally incapable of treating American forces as genuine partners rather than promising students. And they began suspecting that this attitude reflected something larger than one man's personality. A broader British difficulty accepting that the balance of power within the alliance had shifted irreparably toward Washington. These lessons would prove prophetic when the Allies turned their attention to the next objective across the Mediterranean. July 10, 1943. Gulf of Gela, Sicily. The largest amphibious assault in history to that point rolled toward Sicilian beaches in darkness and heavy seas. Operation Husky, the invasion of Italy's largest island, would commit 8 divisions divided between Montgomery's British 8th Army and Patton's newly designated American 7th Army. The operation would test Allied unity as thoroughly as it tested German and Italian defenses. Planning for Husky had been contentious from inception. Initial proposals envisioned dispersed landings across Sicily, seizing ports quickly to ensure adequate supply for subsequent operations. Montgomery detested the concept with characteristic vehemence. His experience in North Africa had convinced him that concentration of force was paramount, that scattering troops across multiple beaches invited defeat in detail. On April 24th, he articulated his objections in terms that brooked no compromise. The Allies should concentrate all landings on Sicily's southeastern corner, giving 8th Army the clear mission of driving straight to Messina, the island's northeastern port and gateway to mainland Italy. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder and Admiral Andrew Cunningham, responsible for air and naval support respectively, opposed Montgomery's plan with arguments that carried substantial weight. Concentrated landings would leave 13 Axis airfields operational, posing unacceptable risks to the invasion fleet. Ships would remain concentrated in limited waters, vulnerable to air attack. Both commanders had earned their reputations through successful operations, and their objections reflected genuine operational concerns rather than personal antagonism. Montgomery's response revealed the full force of his personality and his position within British power structures. He threatened, with Churchill's implicit backing, to resign rather than execute a plan he considered fundamentally flawed. The threat was not idle. Montgomery knew his value to British morale, knew that Churchill could not afford to lose his most successful general over planning disputes with air and naval commanders. Faced with a crisis that threatened to derail the entire invasion, Eisenhower called a conference for May 2nd to resolve the dispute. The meeting exposed fault lines that would widen throughout the war. Montgomery presented his case with confidence that American observers found indistinguishable from arrogance. Tedder and Cunningham defended their positions with professional conviction. Eisenhower, attempting to balance military necessities against coalition politics, ultimately sided with Montgomery. The landings would be concentrated in southeastern Sicily. 8th Army would drive toward Messina. 7th Army would protect 8th Army's left flank. For Patton, reading the final plan in North Africa while preparing his command for invasion, the implications were unmistakable. Once again, American forces had been relegated to supporting roles while British commanders pursued the decisive objectives. 7th Army would guard Montgomery's flank while 8th Army captured Messina. The British would claim victory while Americans provided security. The arrangement rankled for reasons beyond Patton's considerable ego. By July 1943, American forces in the Mediterranean had grown substantially. 7th Army comprised 3 infantry divisions, an armored division, and substantial support troops, a force roughly equivalent to 8th Army in size. American industrial output was flooding Allied stockpiles with equipment, ammunition, and supplies. American air power dominated Mediterranean skies, yet command arrangements treated American forces as auxiliaries to be employed at British discretion. Patton's diary entry from July 12th captured his frustration with brutal honesty. Alexander had visited 7th Army headquarters with his entirely British staff to present the operational plan, a plan that in Patton's view deliberately excluded Americans from any possibility of taking Messina. "What fools we are," Patton wrote, recognizing that American political leaders had accepted command arrangements that guaranteed American marginalization. The landings on July 10th went reasonably well, despite chaotic airborne operations that scattered British and American paratroopers across the Sicilian countryside. By dawn, both armies had secured their beachheads and were pushing inland. Italian coastal divisions crumbled quickly. German counterattacks against Gela Beach, where Patton's forces landed, were defeated through determined fighting by the 1st Infantry Division and devastating naval gunfire from supporting warships. Montgomery, confident that Axis resistance would collapse before methodical British pressure, signaled Alexander that the route to Messina lay open. 8th Army would drive straight up the eastern coast. 7th Army should hold defensively, protecting 8th Army's flank while Montgomery pursued what he assumed would be demoralized defenders. The signal revealed assumptions that would define Montgomery's treatment of American forces throughout the war. British troops would deliver knockout blows while Americans provided security. Reality intruded swiftly. German forces, far from collapsing, established defensive positions that exploited Sicily's mountainous terrain with professional skill. 8th Army's advance bogged down south of Catania, where German paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division held positions that channelized British attacks into killing zones. Mount Etna dominated the landscape, forcing attackers into predictable avenues of approach. Montgomery's methodical tactics, so effective in the open desert, struggled against defenders who could concentrate forces on narrow fronts. On July 12th, as 8th Army's advance stalled, Montgomery sent Alexander a signal that would define Anglo-American relations for years afterward. He proposed expanding 8th Army's operational area westward, effectively commandeering Highway 124, a key road previously assigned to 7th Army. The expanded frontage would allow him to outflank German positions blocking his coastal advance. American forces should, Montgomery suggested, halt and defend, while 8th Army executed the maneuver that would crack Sicily open. The signal's tone mattered as much as its content. Montgomery did not request Alexander's approval. He informed Alexander of his intentions and suggested that American forces adjust accordingly. The presumption was staggering. Montgomery was proposing to appropriate American operational areas, relegate American forces to static defense, and execute a strategy that ensured British forces alone would receive credit for Sicily's conquest. Alexander agreed. On July 13th, he issued orders assigning Montgomery the disputed road and instructing Patton to hold defensively. For American commanders reading the order, The message was unmistakable. British preferences would determine Allied strategy, regardless of American contributions or capabilities. Patton's initial response demonstrated the political constraints that frustrated American commanders throughout the war. Despite fury expressed in diary entries comparing Montgomery to an arrogant prima donna, Patton formally accepted the order without protest. He understood that Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in the Mediterranean, could not afford open revolt by subordinate commanders. Coalition warfare required accommodation, even when accommodation meant swallowing justified anger. But Patton had no intention of allowing 7th Army to sit idle while Montgomery pursued glory. If Alexander would not assign Americans an independent mission, Patton would create one. He flew to Alexander's headquarters on July 17th, carrying a map and a proposal. Rather than defend passively, 7th Army would drive northwest toward Palermo, Sicily's capital and principal port. The operation would cut the island in half, trap Italian forces in western Sicily, and secure port facilities that would ease American supply difficulties. Alexander, perhaps surprised by Patton's initiative, or simply relieved to see American aggression directed away from Montgomery's operations, approved. The decision fundamentally altered the Sicilian campaign. Rather than a single British advance up the eastern coast, supported by American defensive operations, the Allies would now conduct 2 separate offensives. Montgomery would continue grinding toward Messina from the south. Patton would race to Palermo, then turn east and drive toward Messina along Sicily's northern coast. What began as strategic adjustment rapidly became personal competition. Patton drove 7th Army with characteristic intensity, demanding speeds that shocked both allies and enemies. American forces covered rugged terrain at rates Montgomery's deliberate approach could never match. 12 days after landing, American troops entered Palermo on July 22nd, capturing Sicily's largest city and demonstrating that American commanders could achieve operational results without British supervision. Montgomery, meanwhile, continued grinding against German defenses around Mount Etna. His progress was measured and professional, but increasingly irrelevant to the campaign's outcome. German commanders, recognizing that Sicily could not be held indefinitely, had begun preparing evacuation to mainland Italy. The question was no longer whether the Allies would conquer Sicily, but which Allied army would reach Messina first. The race revealed differences in military culture as much as command personality. Patton pushed 7th Army to the limits of endurance, accepting casualties and equipment losses as acceptable costs for speed. American engineers repaired roads and bridges with remarkable improvisation. American infantry marched through July heat across mountainous terrain at paces that left support units struggling to maintain contact. Montgomery's 8th Army, facing admittedly stronger opposition on more difficult terrain, advanced with careful attention to casualty rates and logistics. British commanders, trained to minimize losses, refused to risk disasters in pursuit of rapid advance. On August 17, 1943, elements of Patton's 3rd Infantry Division entered Messina several hours before British forces arrived. 7th Army had won the race. But the victory's taste was bitter in ways that revealed the toxic state of Anglo-American command relationships. Montgomery's public response combined surface graciousness with subtle dismissal. He congratulated Patton while emphasizing the difficulties 8th Army had faced against German defenders. The comparison implied that terrain and opposition, not command skill, explained the outcome. British press coverage reflected this framing, celebrating 8th Army's fighting while treating 7th Army's advance as a sideshow against inferior opposition. For American commanders, Sicily confirmed patterns established in Tunisia. British narratives would always center British achievements, regardless of objective reality. Montgomery in particular seemed incapable of acknowledging that American commanders might possess skills comparable to his own, or that American forces deserved credit commensurate with their contributions. As Allied planners turned attention toward Italy, and eventually the cross-channel invasion of France, one fact had become undeniable. Bernard Montgomery viewed himself as the preeminent Allied battlefield commander and expected deference accordingly. That American commanders increasingly viewed Montgomery as the primary obstacle to genuine partnership seemed not to register with the British Field Marshal. Or perhaps it simply did not matter. September 1st, 1944, Granville, France. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery sat rigid in the cramped cabin of General Dwight Eisenhower's personal aircraft, his irritation barely concealed beneath a thin veneer of military courtesy. Outside, the landscape of liberated France stretched toward horizons that seemed to promise imminent victory. Paris had fallen 6 days earlier. German forces were streaming eastward in disorder that veterans compared to the collapse of 1918. The war surely would end by Christmas. But Montgomery had not come to discuss victory. He had come to prevent what he considered a catastrophic mistake. In his briefcase lay maps and memoranda outlining a strategic concept he believed could end the war within weeks. In Eisenhower's possession lay orders that would, from Montgomery's perspective, squander the greatest opportunity of the entire campaign. The Supreme Commander had decided to assume personal command of all Allied ground forces. Montgomery, who had directed both American and British armies since D-Day, would be reduced to commanding only 21st Army Group. His American counterpart, General Omar Bradley, would command the 12th Army Group as an equal rather than a subordinate. The meeting that followed would crystallize every tension that had accumulated since Tunisia. Montgomery presented his case with characteristic directness. The broad front strategy Eisenhower intended to pursue was fundamentally unsound. Advancing into Germany with multiple armies attacking simultaneously would disperse resources, prevent decisive concentration, and guarantee that the war would drag into 1945. The correct approach was obvious to anyone who understood military principles. Concentrate all available forces for a single powerful thrust into northern Germany, cross the Rhine, seize the Ruhr industrial region, and drive to Berlin before German forces could establish coherent defenses. The thrust, naturally, would be commanded by Montgomery. American forces would provide flank protection and logistical support, while British and Canadian armies delivered the decisive blow. Eisenhower would retain his title as Supreme Commander, but delegate operational control to the one general who had demonstrated consistent success against German forces. Eisenhower listened with patience that masked growing frustration. He had heard variations of this proposal since August, each iteration more insistent than the last. Montgomery seemed constitutionally incapable of accepting that political realities constrained military options. American forces now comprised over 60 divisions in the European theater. British and Canadian forces numbered fewer than 20. American logistics sustained Allied operations. American air power dominated European skies. American industrial capacity provided the material foundation for everything the Allies accomplished. The political implications of Montgomery's proposal were as significant as its military merits. The British Field Marshal was asking American political leaders to subordinate their armies to British command for an operation that would ensure British forces under British leadership delivered the decisive blow ending the war. He was requesting that American troops serve as Montgomery's shield while he achieved final victory. He was demanding, in effect, that Eisenhower surrender operational control to a subordinate who made no secret of his contempt for the Supreme Commander's strategic judgment. The conversation grew heated. Montgomery, according to his own later account, lectured Eisenhower on military principles with a condescension that the Supreme Commander found intolerable. At one point, Eisenhower leaned forward, placed his hand on Montgomery's knee, and spoke with quiet intensity that silenced the field marshal mid-sentence. "Steady, Monty. You can't speak to me like that. I'm your boss." Montgomery fell silent. The moment passed, but the fundamental disagreement remained unresolved, festering beneath surface courtesies that fooled neither man. The strategic debate was not merely personal rivalry dressed in operational language. Genuine military considerations supported both positions. Montgomery's single-thrust concept offered the possibility of ending the war quickly, before German forces could recover from their summer disasters. A concentrated drive by 40 divisions, adequately supplied, might indeed reach the Rhine before winter and the Ruhr before spring. The war could end in 1944, saving hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. But the risks were equally substantial. A narrow thrust deep into Germany would create an elongated salient vulnerable to counterattack from both flanks. German forces, however battered, retained the capacity for local concentrations that could cut supply lines and isolate advanced units. The single highway that would supply Montgomery's advance could be interdicted by determined defenders. Most fundamentally, the concept assumed that German resistance had collapsed to the point where rapid advance would face minimal opposition. Every intelligence assessment suggested this assumption was optimistic at best. Eisenhower's broad front approach offered different advantages and different risks. Multiple armies advancing simultaneously would prevent German forces from concentrating against any single threat. The advance would be slower but more secure, maintaining contact along the entire front and preventing the kind of surprise counterattack that had destroyed armies throughout military history. Logistics would be strained but manageable, with each army responsible for its own supply lines, rather than funneling everything through a single vulnerable corridor. The approach also satisfied political requirements that Montgomery dismissed as irrelevant, but Eisenhower could not ignore. American public opinion would not accept American armies serving indefinitely under British command. American generals, particularly Patton, would not subordinate their operations to Montgomery's direction. The alliance itself might fracture if British leadership were imposed on forces that had become overwhelmingly American in composition. Eisenhower chose compromise. He would not concentrate all forces for Montgomery's northern thrust, but he would give 21st Army Group priority for supplies and authorize a limited operation to seize bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands. The operation, designated Market Garden, would employ 3 airborne divisions to capture bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. British ground forces would advance rapidly across the captured bridges, establish a bridgehead over the Rhine, and position 21st Army Group for subsequent operations into Germany. The decision satisfied no one completely. Montgomery received authorization for his operation, but not the resources he considered necessary for success. Bradley and Patton watched fuel allocations shift northward to support an operation they considered recklessly optimistic. Eisenhower maintained coalition unity, but pleased neither subordinate fully. For Patton, commanding Third Army as it drove toward Germany through eastern France, the supply reallocation was particularly bitter. His forces had demonstrated, during August, what aggressive American operations could achieve. Third Army had advanced faster and farther than any force in military history, covering distances that German commanders considered impossible. Patton's spearheads were approaching the Moselle River and the German border. The Reich itself lay within reach. Then the supplies stopped. Fuel allocations that had sustained Third Army's advance were redirected northward to support Montgomery's operation. Patton's tanks, which had been consuming 400,000 gallons of gasoline daily, received barely enough to maintain defensive positions. The army that had liberated most of France ground to a halt not from German resistance but from empty fuel tanks. Patton's reaction, recorded in his diary and expressed to anyone who would listen, mixed fury with prophecy. "We are about to halt Third Army so Montgomery can make a stupid attack in the north. The attack will fail, and then winter will come, and we will have lost our chance to end the war this year." The prediction would prove devastatingly accurate. September 17, 1944, the Netherlands. Operation Market Garden commenced with the largest airborne operation in history. Over 35,000 American and British paratroopers dropped from transport aircraft and descended in gliders onto Dutch fields, tasked with seizing bridges before German forces could destroy them. The 101st Airborne Division would capture bridges at Eindhoven and Veghel. The 82nd Airborne Division would seize crossings at Grave and Nijmegen. The British 1st Airborne Division, reinforced by the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, would capture the ultimate prize, the bridge at Arnhem spanning the Lower Rhine. British ground forces, led by Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks' XXX Corps, would advance northward along a single highway, linking up with each airborne division in sequence, and crossing into Germany before defenders could organize effective resistance. The plan required XXX Corps to cover 64 miles in 2 to 3 days, a rate of advance that assumed minimal opposition and perfect coordination between ground and airborne forces. The assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. Intelligence officers had detected German armored units near Arnhem, including elements of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, refitting after their mauling in Normandy. Major Brian Urquhart, intelligence chief for British Airborne Corps, presented evidence that 2 panzer divisions were positioned precisely where 1st Airborne Division would land. His warnings were dismissed. Montgomery's headquarters, committed to the operation's success, chose to believe that the German units were too depleted to pose serious threat. Urquhart was sent on medical leave, officially for exhaustion, effectively for raising inconvenient objections. The airborne landings on September 17th achieved initial surprise but immediately encountered difficulties that compounded throughout the operation. Drop zones for 1st Airborne Division were located 6 to 8 miles from Arnhem Bridge, a distance that allowed German forces time to organize defense before British paratroopers could reach their objective. Only one battalion, the 2nd Parachute Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, reached the bridge and secured its northern end. The remaining battalions were blocked by German forces that materialized with unexpected strength and coordination. At Nijmegen, the 82nd Airborne captured the bridge over the Waal River only after a desperate assault crossing on September 20th that cost heavy casualties. At Eindhoven and along the highway between captured bridges, German forces launched counterattacks that repeatedly cut XXX Corps' single supply route. The highway, which the British would later call Hell's Highway, became a death trap where armored vehicles could neither advance quickly nor maneuver off roads bordered by marshland and drainage ditches. Lieutenant Colonel Frost's battalion held the northern end of Arnhem Bridge for 4 days against mounting German pressure. The men fought from buildings overlooking the bridge approaches, repelling armored attacks with Piat anti-tank weapons and grenades. German artillery reduced their positions to rubble. Tank fire set buildings ablaze. Ammunition ran low, then out. Medical supplies were exhausted within 48 hours. Frost himself was wounded on September 20th, but continued commanding until German forces finally overwhelmed his remaining troops on September 21st. XXX Corps, struggling against resistance that Montgomery's planning had dismissed as negligible, never reached Arnhem. The relief force was 11 miles short when the last organized resistance at the bridge collapsed. The bridgehead across the Rhine, Market Garden's entire purpose, was never established. By September 25th, when Major General Roy Urquhart ordered the survivors of 1st Airborne Division to withdraw across the river, the operation had become the worst Allied defeat since the fall of France. Of approximately 10,000 men who had landed at Arnhem, only 2,398 escaped. Over 400 were dead. The remainder, more than 6,000 paratroopers, were prisoners. Total Allied casualties for Market Garden exceeded 17,000 killed, wounded, and captured. The Rhine remained uncrossed. German defenses in the Netherlands solidified into positions that would hold until spring 1945. American reactions combined vindication with fury. Patton and Bradley had opposed Market Garden from its inception, arguing that the operation's risks wildly exceeded potential benefits. They had suggested that resources allocated to Montgomery's scheme would be better employed continuing American advances toward Germany. Patton, in particular, had argued that Third Army, properly supplied, could reach the Rhine before German forces established defensive positions. Their objections had been dismissed, overruled by political necessity and Montgomery's insistent certainty. Now, with Market Garden's failure undeniable, American commanders felt entitled to satisfaction that events had confirmed their judgment. But satisfaction was overwhelmed by rage at Montgomery's response to the disaster. Rather than accepting responsibility for an operation he had conceived, planned, and commanded, Montgomery characterized Market Garden as 90% successful. The claim defied comprehension. The operation's purpose was to establish a bridgehead over the Rhine. This had not been achieved. The bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen had been captured, true, but they led nowhere useful without the Arnhem crossing. Allied forces had liberated a narrow corridor of Dutch territory, but at a cost of 17,000 casualties and the destruction of an elite airborne division. Yet Montgomery was declaring victory. The audacity was breathtaking, rewriting catastrophic failure as modest success through sheer force of assertion. Montgomery's post-war memoir would elaborate this interpretation with additional distortions. He blamed inadequate resources, claiming he had requested 40 divisions for the operation, but received only 35. He blamed weather that prevented reinforcement drops. He blamed XXXX Corps for advancing too slowly. He blamed intelligence for failing to detect German armor. What he never blamed was himself, his planning, his dismissal of warnings, his assumptions about German capabilities. For American commanders, Montgomery's deflection confirmed patterns they had observed since Tunisia. When Montgomery succeeded, credit was his alone. When operations faltered, explanations involved inadequate resources, insufficient support, or others' failures. Personal responsibility for setbacks was conspicuously absent from Montgomery's narrative. The deflection was more than vanity. It was dangerous to alliance cohesion. Montgomery's public criticisms of Eisenhower's strategy, his comments to British press suggesting that his plan would have ended the war had it been properly resourced, his signals to Churchill implying that American strategic foolishness had squandered victory, all undermined the Supreme Commander's authority and poisoned relationships between national commands. Bradley, reading reports of Montgomery's statements, recognized the pattern from Sicily and Tunisia. Montgomery was protecting his reputation at the cost of alliance unity. He was blaming others for failures that resulted from his own planning errors. And he was, American commanders increasingly suspected, incapable of acknowledging that he could be wrong. The winter of 1944 approached with the war unfinished. German forces, given time to establish defensive positions by Market Garden's failure and the supply diversions that had halted American advances, prepared fortifications along the West Wall that would cost thousands of additional lives to breach. The opportunity to end the war in 1944, an opportunity that Patton had seen clearly in August, had evaporated in the ice fields of the Netherlands. October and November brought grinding operations that satisfied no one. Montgomery's forces cleared the Scheldt estuary to open the port of Antwerp, an operation that should have preceded Market Garden, but was delayed while Montgomery pursued his bridge too far. American forces attacked toward the Roer Dams and the Hurtgen Forest, suffering casualties that exceeded Market Garden's losses for minimal territorial gain. Throughout these months, Montgomery continued advocating for his single-thrust strategy, continued criticizing the broad front approach, continued implying that American strategic naivete was prolonging the war. His relationship with Bradley, never warm, deteriorated into barely concealed hostility. His relationship with Patton had passed beyond hostility into something approaching contempt on both sides. Eisenhower, trapped between British and American commanders who could barely communicate civilly, struggled to maintain coalition unity while prosecuting a war that refused to end. His diplomatic skills, honed through years of managing Allied personalities, were tested daily by subordinates who seemed more interested in fighting each other than fighting Germans. The command structure that had delivered victory in Normandy was fracturing under the strains of frustrated ambition, national pride, and personal animosity. Montgomery's conduct, more than any other single factor, had created an environment where American commanders viewed their British counterparts not as allies, but as obstacles. December approached with Allied forces still west of the Rhine, still short of the objectives that September's optimism had suggested were within easy reach. German forces, written off as defeated in August, had reconstituted defensive capabilities that would shortly demonstrate themselves in ways that no Allied commander anticipated. The stage was set for the war's greatest crisis and for the confrontation that would finally reveal the full depths of Anglo-American command dysfunction. December 20th, 1944, Luxembourg City. General Omar Bradley gripped the telephone receiver with knuckles white against the black bakelite, his Missouri composure shattering under the weight of words he could barely process. Across the wire, General Dwight Eisenhower's voice carried the measured cadence of a man delivering news he knew would wound. 2 American armies, the 1st and the 9th, were being transferred to British command, to Montgomery's command. 4 days earlier, German forces had launched their final great offensive in the West, smashing through thinly held American positions in the Ardennes forest with a fury that caught Allied intelligence completely unprepared. 3 German armies, comprising over 400,000 troops and 1,400 tanks, had torn a bulge 60 miles deep into American lines. German spearheads were racing toward the Meuse River crossings. If they reached Antwerp, the Allied front would be split in two, and the war's outcome would be thrown into doubt. Eisenhower's decision had military logic. The German penetration had physically separated Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg from the 1st and 9th Armies fighting north of the breakthrough. Communications were disrupted. Coordination was difficult. Montgomery's 21st Army Group, positioned north of the Bulge, could more easily direct operations for the separated American forces. But the logic provided no comfort. Bradley heard in Eisenhower's words the fulfillment of everything Montgomery had sought since Normandy. American armies under British command, American soldiers serving British strategic purposes, American blood purchasing British glory. The accumulated frustrations of 2 years, from Tunisia through Sicily, through the endless debates over strategy, crystallized into a single moment of unbearable clarity. "By God, Ike," Bradley erupted, his voice cracking with emotion he rarely displayed. "I cannot be responsible to the American people if you do this. I resign." The line fell silent. Then Eisenhower's response came, cold and precise, carrying the weight of supreme command. "Brad, I, not you, am responsible to the American people. Your resignation therefore means absolutely nothing." Bradley made one more protest, then fell silent. The order stood. 1st Army and 9th Army would pass to Montgomery's control. American forces would serve under British command during the greatest crisis of the European War. The German offensive, designated Wacht am Rhein by Hitler's headquarters, had achieved surprise that Allied commanders would spend decades explaining. Intelligence had detected German troop movements, supply accumulations, radio traffic patterns that suggested offensive preparations. But Allied headquarters, convinced that German forces lacked the capability for major operations, had interpreted the evidence as defensive preparations. The possibility that Hitler would risk his last reserves on a desperate gamble through the same Ardennes terrain where German forces had shattered French defenses in 1940 seemed too improbable to credit. The attack struck American positions held by a mixture of exhausted veteran divisions recovering from Hurtgen Forest and Green divisions receiving their first combat experience. The 106th Infantry Division, in the line for barely 5 days, disintegrated under the German onslaught. 2 of its 3 regiments, over 8,000 men, surrendered in the war's largest mass capitulation of American forces. The 28th Infantry Division, already bled white in Hurtgen, was torn apart by German armor. Isolated units fought desperate holding actions, while German spearheads flowed around them toward objectives in the Allied rear. By December 18th, the situation appeared critical. German forces had penetrated 40 miles into American territory. The vital road junction at Bastogne was surrounded, its garrison of the 101st Airborne Division and elements of other units cut off from relief. Kampfgruppe Piper, the armored spearhead of 1st SS Panzer Division, was racing toward the Meuse bridges, leaving a trail of atrocities including the massacre of 84 American prisoners at Malmedy. Eisenhower, recognizing that the crisis demanded unified command, made his decision on December 19th. Montgomery would take control of all forces north of the German penetration. Bradley would retain command of forces to the south, principally Patton's Third Army. The arrangement was temporary, intended to restore coordination until the crisis passed. Montgomery received the command transfer with satisfaction that he made little effort to conceal. His aide, Captain Carroll Mather, recorded the field marshal's reaction. He was thrilled. Here was the justification for everything he had argued since September. American command arrangements had failed. American forces had been surprised and overwhelmed. British professionalism would restore the situation. Montgomery arrived at 1st Army headquarters on December 20th, with an entourage that American officers found grating under the circumstances. According to multiple accounts, he entered like Christ come to cleanse the temple, striding through American staff officers with an air of barely concealed condescension. His first actions combined genuine military competence with characteristic self-promotion. He repositioned reserves to block German approaches to the Meuse. He established defensive lines that would channel German advances into killing zones. He coordinated artillery concentrations that would devastate attacking formations. But he also began shaping the narrative of his intervention in ways that American commanders would never forgive. Montgomery's initial assessment, communicated to Eisenhower and to London, portrayed American forces as more disorganized than they actually were. He described 1st Army as needing to be tidied up, as if American commanders had lost control of their formations. He positioned British units along the Meuse as if American forces couldn't be trusted to hold the river crossings, and he began making statements to his staff, to visiting officers, eventually to journalists, that characterized his assumption of command as rescuing American forces from disaster. The reality was considerably more complex. American forces had been surprised and had suffered severe losses in the offensive's opening days. But by December 20th, when Montgomery took command, the defensive situation had already begun stabilizing. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne was holding against repeated German attacks, tying down forces that might otherwise have exploited the breakthrough. Scattered American units throughout the Ardennes were fighting tenacious delaying actions that disrupted German timetables. And Patton's Third Army, with a speed that would become legendary, was already pivoting northward to relieve Bastogne and strike the German southern flank. Montgomery's contribution was real, but limited. He imposed coordination on forces that were already fighting effectively. He provided reserves that reinforced defensive positions. He demonstrated, under genuine crisis conditions, the methodical competence that had characterized his best operations. But he did not, as his narrative would later suggest, save American forces from collapse. The crisis at Bastogne became the battle's defining episode and the source of its most enduring controversy. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded since December 20th, held the town against repeated German assaults that included infantry attacks, armored probes, and devastating artillery bombardments. Acting Division Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, when presented with a German surrender demand on December 22nd, delivered a one-word response that would enter military legend: nuts. The defense of Bastogne embodied everything American commanders believed distinguished their forces from their British allies: aggressive spirit, willingness to accept risk, determination to hold regardless of odds. The paratroopers of the 101st, short of ammunition, medical supplies, and winter clothing, held against a German force that outnumbered them significantly. They held not through methodical preparation, but through the combat spirit that Patton had cultivated and Montgomery had never understood. Relief came on December 26th, when lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through German lines to reach Bastogne. The relief column's advance represented one of the war's most remarkable operational achievements. Patton had pivoted Third Army 90 degrees in winter conditions, moving over 100,000 men and their equipment northward through freezing weather and contested roads. The maneuver, executed in 72 hours, demonstrated exactly the aggressive flexibility that American commanders believed their forces possessed and that British caution could never match. By late December, the German offensive had been contained. The Meuse bridges remained in Allied hands. German spearheads, starved of fuel and hammered by Allied air power once weather cleared, began withdrawing from their deepest penetrations. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble in the West, had failed. The battle's cost was staggering. American forces suffered approximately 89,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed and 23,000 captured. German losses were comparable, with estimates ranging from 80,000 to 100,000 casualties. But Germany, unlike America, could not replace its losses. The divisions destroyed in the Ardennes represented Hitler's last strategic reserve. When the Allies resumed their advance in January, they would face defenders who lacked the strength to stop them. Montgomery's conduct during the battle had been professionally competent. His conduct after the battle would permanently destroy his relationship with American commanders. January 7, 1945. Montgomery's tactical headquarters, Zonhoven, Belgium. The field marshal had summoned journalists to a press conference ostensibly intended to praise American troops and defend Eisenhower against criticism that the Supreme Commander had been surprised by the German offensive. What emerged instead was a masterclass in self-promotion, disguised as gracious compliment. Montgomery began with praise for American soldiers that seemed genuine enough. The battle had been most interesting. I think possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled. The American forces had fought magnificently. They had displayed courage and determination that deserved recognition. But the narrative quickly shifted. Montgomery described his own actions upon taking command in terms that portrayed American forces as requiring rescue. As soon as I saw what was happening, I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over that river. He described how he had tidied up the battlefield, how he had positioned reserves, how his intervention had stabilized a situation that American commanders had allowed to deteriorate. Throughout the recitation, British actions were highlighted and Montgomery's brilliance emphasized. American commanders were conspicuously absent from the narrative, except as recipients of Montgomery's guidance. The desperate stands at St. Vith and Bastogne, the fighting withdrawal that had bought time for reserves to concentrate, Patton's brilliant relief operation. All were subordinated to Montgomery's story of arriving to impose order on chaos. The press conference's most damaging aspect was not what Montgomery said, but what he implied. Without directly criticizing American commanders, he created an impression that American forces had been saved by British professionalism. Without acknowledging Patton's contribution, he suggested that his own command arrangements had made victory possible. Without stating outright that American generalship had failed, he constructed a narrative in which British intervention had been decisive. German propaganda recognized the gift immediately. Radio broadcasts quoted Montgomery's statements as evidence of Allied disunity. Joseph Goebbels' ministry portrayed the American transfer to British command as proof that American forces couldn't fight without British supervision. The psychological warfare value of Montgomery's press conference exceeded anything German propagandists could have fabricated. American reaction was explosive. Bradley, reading press reports of the conference at his Luxembourg headquarters, felt betrayal that bordered on physical pain. Montgomery had commanded 1st and 9th Armies for barely 3 weeks. Those armies had fought magnificently, holding against overwhelming odds until German offensive momentum exhausted itself. Bradley's own headquarters had coordinated the defensive operations that contained the penetration. Yet Montgomery's narrative erased American command contributions and elevated British intervention to central importance. The press conference, Bradley later wrote, was one of the most arrogant, egotistical statements I had ever read. It was all there. The condescension. The assumption that British wisdom must guide American strength. The inability to acknowledge that American commanders might possess competence comparable to his own. Patton's reaction was characteristically direct. "Montgomery is a tired little fart," he wrote in his diary. "War requires the taking of risks, and he won't take them." His own army's relief of Bastogne, the operational achievement that had actually turned the battle's tide, had been reduced to a footnote in Montgomery's self-congratulatory narrative. The crisis extended beyond personal anger to threaten the alliance itself. Bradley called Eisenhower with an ultimatum he had never before considered necessary. He could not serve under Montgomery. If Eisenhower intended to give the British Field Marshal permanent command of American forces, Bradley would resign, and he would not resign quietly. The ultimatum was not idle threat. Bradley, normally the most diplomatically skilled of American commanders, had reached his breaking point. The accumulated frustrations of 2 years, the constant minimization of American achievements, the endless assumption that British guidance was necessary for American success, had finally become intolerable. Eisenhower, recognizing that Allied unity hung by a thread, attempted to calm Bradley while drafting a message to the combined chiefs of staff in Washington and London. The message, though never sent in its original form, stated plainly that Eisenhower would request Montgomery's relief unless the Field Marshal apologized and ceased his public criticisms of American command. The threat reached Montgomery through British channels. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff and Montgomery's most powerful protector, recognized that his protégé had finally gone too far. Churchill, watching the crisis unfold, understood that British political interests required accommodation with American sensibilities. The coalition that had defeated Germany could not be allowed to fracture over one general's ego. On January 12th, Montgomery wrote to Eisenhower expressing regret for any offense his press conference had caused. To Bradley, he sent a conciliatory letter praising American troops and expressing gratitude for the honor of commanding them temporarily. The letters were gracious, apparently sincere, and largely irrelevant. The damage was done. American commanders now understood with crystalline clarity that Montgomery would never view them as genuine partners. Every operation would be filtered through Montgomery's assessment of how it affected his reputation. Every failure would be explained by insufficient support or others' errors. Every success would be claimed as validation of Montgomery's wisdom. Churchill, recognizing that Montgomery's narrative had created a political crisis requiring political correction, spoke in Parliament on January 18th. His words were carefully calibrated to repair Allied relationships while acknowledging military realities. The Battle of the Bulge, Churchill stated clearly, was predominantly an American battle. It would be recorded as an ever-famous American victory. British forces had played a supporting role, as coalition partners should. The speech was diplomatic necessity, contradicting Montgomery's narrative and acknowledging that American forces had won the battle through American courage and American command. The remaining months of the war saw Montgomery increasingly marginalized. American armies, now comprising over 60 divisions compared to fewer than 20 British and Canadian divisions, dominated Allied operations. Bradley's 12th Army Group directed the main effort toward the Rhine. Patton's 3rd Army advanced with characteristic aggression. Montgomery's 21st Army Group conducted supporting operations in the north. The field marshal continued advocating for his strategic concepts, continued implying that American approaches were inferior, continued suggesting that he alone understood how to defeat Germany. But his influence had waned. American commanders no longer felt obligated to defer to British sensibilities. American political leaders no longer accepted that coalition warfare required American subordination to British direction. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The European War was over. Victory belonged to an Allied coalition that had overcome not just Nazi tyranny, but also internal divisions that had repeatedly threatened to tear it apart. In the euphoria of peace, old conflicts were temporarily submerged. Montgomery received accolades from a grateful British public that saw in him the embodiment of national resistance to Hitler. American commanders returned home to celebrations that recognized their achievements. The alliance that had won the war seemed destined to become the foundation for post-war cooperation. But the conflicts resurfaced in memoirs and histories written after the war. Montgomery's published recollections, appearing in 1958, reignited every controversy by criticizing Eisenhower's leadership and implicitly claiming that Montgomery's strategic vision had been superior to the Supreme Commander's broad front approach. Eisenhower, then President of the United States, broke off personal contact with Montgomery, refusing to correspond with a former colleague who seemed determined to refight battles from a vanished war. Bradley's memoir, A Soldier's Story, published in 1951, meticulously documented instances where Montgomery's conduct had undermined Allied operations. The book's measured tone made its criticisms more devastating than Patton's intemperate diary entries. Bradley wrote not as a personal enemy, but as a professional officer recording failures that had cost lives and prolonged the war. American histories of the conflict, drawing on these accounts and official records, presented Montgomery as talented but difficult, brilliant but insufferable. His contributions were acknowledged. The victory at El Alamein that had reversed British fortunes, the careful planning that had made D-Day successful, the tactical competence that had characterized his best operations. But his personality was depicted as a liability to coalition warfare, a source of friction that had created unnecessary obstacles to Allied effectiveness. British historians defended Montgomery with arguments that carried genuine weight. He had never lost a major battle after assuming command in North Africa. His concern for casualties reflected lessons learned in the trenches of the First World War, where British generals had squandered lives through reckless offensive operations. His methodical approach, whatever its limitations, had delivered consistent success against German forces. American criticisms, British defenders suggested, reflected jealousy of British professionalism and resentment of British military traditions. The debate continued for decades after the participants' deaths. Historians argued about Montgomery's true contributions, about whether American frustrations were justified, about how personalities had affected military operations. Some concluded that Montgomery was a great commander, poorly suited to coalition warfare. Others suggested that American commanders, lacking Montgomery's experience, had resented his superior judgment. Still others argued that the conflicts reflected inevitable tensions when proud nations attempt to cooperate in existential struggle. But beneath historiographical debates lay a simpler truth, one that American commanders of the Second World War understood with crystalline clarity. Bernard Montgomery, for all his talents, could not treat American forces as equals. Whether this incapacity reflected personal arrogance, cultural prejudice, or British determination to maintain fading imperial supremacy remained debatable. What was indisputable was that Montgomery's conduct had poisoned Allied relationships and created unnecessary obstacles to coalition effectiveness. The American experience with Montgomery provided lessons that outlived the war. Future coalition operations would be structured to prevent personality conflicts from undermining military effectiveness. Command arrangements would be designed to ensure proportional representation and prevent any nation from dominating simply through superior confidence or historical precedent. And American military culture would internalize wariness of allies who confused partnership with subordination. For the Americans who fought alongside Montgomery from Tunisia to Germany, the field marshal represented everything they believed they had left behind in 7 the assumption that British wisdom must guide American strength, the conviction that colonial enthusiasm required metropolitan sophistication to succeed, the belief that New World energy needed Old World experience to avoid disaster. They discovered that battlefield excellence, industrial might, and military success could not overcome cultural assumptions rooted in centuries of British global dominance. Montgomery never understood this. To his death in 1976, he maintained that his wartime conduct had been appropriate, his criticisms justified, his strategic vision superior to the alternatives that Eisenhower had chosen. American commanders who survived him offered different verdicts. They acknowledged Montgomery's tactical skills while questioning his strategic judgment. They praised his careful preparation while noting that wars are won by boldness as well as caution. They conceded his concern for casualties while observing that Montgomery's caution sometimes allowed enemies to escape destruction that aggressive pursuit might have achieved. The final assessment belonged to Eisenhower, writing years after the war with the perspective that distance provides. He acknowledged Montgomery's abilities without reservation, but he noted the field marshal's complete inability to understand the political dimensions of coalition command. Montgomery, Eisenhower concluded, was a man whose military talents were undeniable, but whose lack of diplomatic sensitivity made him unsuited for senior command in Allied operations. It was perhaps the most devastating critique possible. Not that Montgomery lacked military competence, but that his virtues were overwhelmed by vices that undermined the very cause he served. In coalition warfare, where personality affects effectiveness as profoundly as tactics or strategy, Montgomery's incapacity for treating allies as partners made him not merely difficult, but dangerous. The Americans learned this lesson through bitter experience. From North African sand to German mud, they discovered that military alliances require more than shared enemies. They demand mutual respect, acknowledgement of partners' contributions, and willingness to subordinate ego to collective purpose. Montgomery, whatever his other qualities, could not meet these requirements. And in that failure lay the answer to why the Americans hated Monty. Not because he was British, not because he was cautious, not because he demanded resources or criticized strategy, but because he made them feel like colonial auxiliaries in a war they were winning. Soldiers whose blood mattered, but whose judgment did not. Allies valued only insofar as they facilitated British glory. That memory outlasted Montgomery, outlasted the generation that served with him, outlasted even the Cold War alliance that grew from wartime cooperation. It served as permanent reminder that technical excellence cannot substitute for human respect. That battlefield brilliance means little if it alienates those whose cooperation victory requires. Bernard Montgomery was many things: brilliant tactician, careful commander, British hero. But to the Americans who fought alongside him, he was also a cautionary tale about the limits of military genius divorced from diplomatic wisdom. The question was never whether Americans recognized Montgomery's talents. They did. The question was whether Montgomery could recognize theirs. He could not. And in that failure of imagination lay the roots of a bitterness that no amount of shared victory could overcome.